Here we go.
The long-awaited return of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart.
I'm very excited.
Jon Stewart is facing massive backlash.
Television is dying. I'm contributing to it. We're just talking here.
Stewart also poked fun at both major party candidates.
It's one show. It was just one show.
What exactly makes for good political satire? Is it wit or creativity?
I've been too busy doing oil paintings. I call this one Doggy Goes to Space.
Maybe it's maintaining some sort of balance or fairness, the ability to effectively critique all sides.
They are the oldest people ever to run for president, breaking by only 4 years the record that they set.
Or perhaps it's accessibility.
TV is dying.
Don't, what? No, sir.
After all, what good is a joke if there's no audience?
Welcome to The Daily Show. I'm your host, Jon Stewart, captain of this dying medium. Why would you even say that to me?
Comedy has always been used to give a more nuanced approach to analyzing current events.
Sorry, you guys. I'm sorry. I can't.
Diane!
Ridiculous.
But if you take the funny out of the equation, it starts to feel more like a lecture. Even if your intentions are good, any attempt at imposing ideas is often met with skepticism. Comedy is different. They say the best jokes always carry a bit of truth.
Nobody knew what to do. Even people at the Oscars were Googling, did Will Smith just slap Chris Rock? I can't believe the Academy has a worse concussion protocol than the NFL.
And some of the best comedians wrap their jokes in ambiguity. You're not supposed to tell which side they're on. You're not even supposed to believe they're being honest.
The news, like other news, is kind of like, this is the most divided this country has ever been. It's like, why? Because we tweet at each other? You know we had a war, right?
These are just jokes. However, the underlying ideas, when paired with laughter, seem much easier to internalize. What results are these worlds colliding.
How many people are at this tea party? When it comes to bombing countries, Congress is a girl who just can't say no.
President Clinton officially came out against same-sex marriages. The president said he is not too crazy about opposite-sex marriages either.
In the 1960s, the BBC had a show called That Was the Week That Was.
It really did try to follow the news. Sometimes we would get a sketch a few minutes before we went on the air, and we went on the air live.
Riding an era of political satire, it was the first nationally televised show to really criticize the UK's government and cause quite a stir.
A year of incompetence, a year of violence.
After all, this was a medium fearful of change. A few years later, you'd have the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour in the United States, which, like its UK predecessor, would generate both popularity and tremendous controversy.
The prime thing is to be entertaining. We were hired as a musical comedy variety show, spiced with thought and value.
I mean, only 10 years prior, the Elvis hip thrust was as problematic as TV would get. There were certainly rumbles of anti-establishment in the 60s, but there was also plenty of censorship. As a result, these shows were typically short-lived.
Any show will be censored, but it should be censored at the lowest level.
But then the 70s brought something different. As TV grew as a medium, so did the public's comfort with criticizing current events. SNL would revolutionize political satire.
Do you think you are being too honest with the American people, and do you still lust after women?
I want to say that you're a very attractive woman.
Its most relevant segment being the Weekend Update.
Now you'd think it would be Australia, but it's not. Now look, pal!
With the success of SNL, the public would grow more comfortable making fun of topics that had previously seemed off limits.
Every aspect of the taste of the show came from, seriously creative people.
And in the 80s, shows like Not Necessarily the News would end up running for much longer. But nothing was ever really as relevant and effective as SNL. It enjoyed a near monopoly on political and pop culture satire. However, in the late 90s, there were some solid competitors. Bill Maher had Politically Incorrect, a talk show that, while airing on Comedy Central for its first few seasons, would center around more serious conversations.
Hillary Clinton went on, I think it was the Today Show. She talked about it almost like it was Roswell. I know there was a place in the White House called Area 69. Did you know that?
While Bill Maher was certainly making a name for himself, there was another rising star.
He is making his network television debut with us here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jon Stewart.
I saw this Klansman on Geraldo. Ignorant creep, Geraldo. But
In 1993, MTV would air The Jon Stewart Show. With prior experience in sketch comedy and hosting, Stewart was able to not only land some pretty big names in television, but prove that he could hang with them as well.
I say big things for you. I say this show's gonna go 7-8 weeks. I'm telling you, the longest show in MTV history.
Unfortunately, it only lasted 3 years. Stewart now was without either a show or steady work. As luck would have it, Comedy Central was having its own issues. After 2 years centered around topics more related to pop culture, its new series The Daily Show was also on shaky ground. Its former host Craig Kilborn had left the show to host The Late Late Show on CBS. Up until this point, the show was fairly successful, and Kilborn had generated quite the loyal audience.
The Nevada Commission added Tyson's brutal amoral behavior makes him ineligible to box, but he remains free to pursue a career as a promoter.
This was surely a big loss, but there was also potential for a new direction. What they wanted was to not only target a younger crowd, but shift the focus from pop culture to politics. What better choice than a former MTV host who had both industry appeal and an audience among the youth?
Speaking of riches, you're about to take over the Daily Show. Congratulations.
Thank
I think
you.
that's a great...
What they didn't realize at the time was that with Jon Stewart at the helm, ratings would quickly and sharply skyrocket.
Early this year, The Daily Show was awarded Television Critics' Outstanding News Award, beating out Meet the Press and Frontline.
Traditional news outlets were much more straightforward in their delivery.
The job of the media seems like it would be our eyes and ears and our protector in this busy world.
They came to tell the Senate they had accused the president of high crimes and misdemeanors.
When that system fails or doesn't do its job, then yeah, you feel vulnerable.
When you have people on for just knee-jerk, reactionary talk.
Wait, I thought you were going to be funny. Come on, be funny.
No, I'm not going to be your monkey.
Stewart's humor was caked in both satire and sarcasm.
Mark Ruffalo and Edward Norton have become acutely aware of environmental dangers since their encounters with gamma radiation. They really have had...
This is not only much more entertaining, but warrants a bit more critical thinking.
Well, I am on your show to announce that I am a candidate for President of the United States.
And I guess I should probably tell you now, we're a fake show.
Bird shot fired from the vice president's weapon apparently wounded a fellow hunter.
To moms and dads, if you're watching right now, I can't emphasize this enough. Don't let your kids go hunting with the vice president.
You felt rewarded for listening.
With material like that, The Daily Show's ratings are up 22% over last year.
The Daily Show also aired every Monday through Thursday. Since competitor shows like SNL would only air once a week and had to be picky with what topics they covered, they couldn't keep their finger on the pulse of current events quite like The Daily Show could. Also, SNL would center around pop culture, whereas The Daily Show would mostly center around politics.
Do you have contempt for American politics?
I have disdain for the way it's conducted.
Even SNL's Weekend Update, its longest running segment, was neither solely political or typically longer than 10 or 15 minutes. Now there were of course other shows on other networks. This was a late night golden era, but late night shows were never usually too political. Audiences were a mixed bag, and given how politically tense the early 2000s were, they'd focus more on celebrity guest appearances.
Blink 182, everybody, our thanks to them.
And less on controversial current events. Late night was incredibly competitive, so naturally you'd want to avoid putting off any portion of your audience. Stewart was in a genre that was not only extremely controversial, but also much less competitive. His only real competition were the major news stations.
You made the right choice. You are leaving this place. You know what you are? You're the last guy out of a burning building, my friend.
John!
You are...
Stop!
Oh, I'm sorry. Are we on CNN right
now? Yeah.
Networks that typically targeted a much older demographic.
Stewart has skills, and he has to be smart because he's rich. Isn't that how it works?
One not interested in either the slapstick comedy or the witty sarcasm. But this wasn't a one-man show. Like SNL, there were a number of recurring segments.
New Jersey has the highest property tax in the nation.
I know, what are you getting for it? Because it's an awful state.
Exactly. It's not an awful state.
Segments where future mainstream successes would find some major traction. People like Stephen Colbert, Samantha Bee, Steve Carell, and Ed Helms.
I love it and recognize how fortunate I am to be in that place at that time. They are not only, I think, talented people, but kind people and reasonable people and like-minded people.
These segments were successful in their own right, so much so that eventually they'd branch out into their own successful series, but we're getting way ahead of ourselves. While the correspondents were certainly successful, they weren't the main draw.
His daily show on Comedy Central has become must-see television for news junkies and politicians alike. And when things get too serious, he's America's favorite political commentator.
The Daily Show skyrocketed in popularity mainly because, well, there's no host in the history of political satire as talented or as effective as Jon Stewart.
He strives to make sense out of the insane and to find joy within darkness.
Never mind the 20 primetime Emmy Awards.
And the Emmy goes to The Daily Show with Jon Stewart.
The Emmy goes to The Daily Show with Jon Stewart.
Never mind the 16 and a half years as a host.
16 years of lampooning the worlds of politics and media.
These are just numbers and accolades, and while the awards speak for themselves, they don't show the full picture. Jon Stewart is not like either his predecessor or the hosts that would follow. If you take a look at The Daily Show's most recent numbers, they've skyrocketed.
That is a show that needs a host. He certainly is a very, very good one.
He's back, sure, but why the repeated success? Maybe it's tied to nostalgia, maybe it's just his loyal fan base, but I don't think it's that simple. Craig Kilborn was more detached and sarcastic. Take a look at hosts like Trevor Noah or Stephen Colbert, and they've got a much sharper, more refined delivery. It's the standard you'd expect for someone in a tailored suit, discussing current events and mingling with high-status celebrities. Stewart seems not that. He's got the suit, sure, but there's a relatability here that I don't really get from other hosts.
And you're here, and we're making TV for you tonight.
To put it more bluntly, he seems way less Hollywood.
You know, we lived in a middle-class neighborhood. It was, you know, my mom was a teacher, my dad worked as a physicist.
I don't know if it's the raspy tone, his ability to be self-deprecating, or his willingness to not talk down, but level with you.
And he never backed down when trying to prove a point.
This is such a great opportunity you have here to actually get politicians
Is this really Jon
off
Stewart?
of their marketing
anyway?
and strategy. Yeah, it's someone who watches your show and cannot take it anymore.
Anytime there's a controversial topic, he handles it with such grace and care that it feels like anything he says, he not only means, but wants you to genuinely consider the discourse at hand.
I don't like performative activism. I've never been a fan of draws attention but without regard for outcome and can be antithetical to the aims of what you're trying to do.
Topics that at times feel way too personal.
And we also left with this one-ish-year-old Brindle Pitbull. We called him Dipper. And we'd come and tape the show and Dipper would wait for me. He met actors and authors and presidents and kings. Dipper passed away yesterday. He was ready, but I wasn't. In a world of good boys, he was the best.
People are comfortable in this man's presence because he so easily allows himself to be vulnerable. He's prepared to publicly bear his emotional pain, even on a scale as large as national television.
His first show after the attacks on 9/11 became one of his most memorable.
This willingness to be transparent has allowed him to sympathize with nearly every guest, and do so without any sort of looming tension.
Every time, John, with you, it's just different.
The problem with traditional news outlets is they're so refined and proper, it leaves little to no room for personality. It's why most news anchors and hosts speak with such a similar cadence. The aura around The Daily Show is far more relaxed. Celebrities can drop the facade and for a brief few minutes, just be themselves.
And then he gets hit by a car and is in a coma.
At the time, we never really understood what we had because, well, 16 years is a long time. You grow accustomed to someone's presence. After a while, there's this feeling of permanence, this idea that they'll always be around. But when he stepped down in 2015, that wasn't the case.
This show doesn't deserve an even slightly restless host, and neither do you.
He was rarely ever seen unless guest starring alongside old friends. Fortunately, when he did surface, he did so under selfless intentions.
Congress passed what was called the Zadroga Act, funded health care for 9/11 first responders who'd gotten sick working at Ground Zero. They actually only funded the Zadroga Act 5 years.
So no reason to not renew it permanently.
Jon Stewart didn't need any more money, but there were some things that his own personal finances couldn't fix.
Stewart is trying to draw attention to expired healthcare benefits for first responders of the 9/11 attacks.
These first responders, many sick with cancers and pulmonary disease, have had to travel at their own expense to Washington, D.C. hundreds of times.
These causes were near and dear to him. They're issues he's been fighting for years, if not decades.
Seeing them put in the work changed my perspective on what activism was.
And what he couldn't do on TV, he'd take directly to Congress.
They responded in 5 seconds. They did their jobs. Courage, grace, tenacity, humility. 18 years later, do yours.
Causing such a stir that they had no other choice but to listen.
The 9/11 first responders bill that's been languishing in Congress for years, it just passed this afternoon. There's Mitch McConnell knowing that he's gonna have to vote for it, and here's our friend Jon Stewart.
Then you think if he's back now and he's a bit of a recluse, surely he'd avoid the limelight that came with the more controversial topics.
Something like tonight we discuss Israel-Palestine.
So then the earlier question arises. Is it just nostalgia, loyalty, or is he simply just that good?
No comedian was allowed to talk about the war. There was a stove too hot to touch. And John was the only voice that helped people decipher that madness.
16 years on one show, and he just strolls on in 8 years later and gets his job back to, once again, a skyrocket in ratings. There is no parallel here. I'm going to be as clear as I possibly can. Jon Stewart is not only the best satirical news broadcaster ever, but one of the greatest TV hosts of all time.
I said to you what was in my heart, what I knew to be true. I said, this is the best job on television. I know now that what I was really saying to you was the best job on television was working for you.
I thank you for that. We thank you for that. Congratulations, Bulldog!